Here we have pocket flaps and the single welt for the jacket. Now, I'm going to turn this over, and this texture makes it a little hard to read, but you can see right there, there is a seam, and there is a seam. Let's see if I can see it better on one of these. Yes, here we are. So you can see we have pivoted the end seams so they sit behind. And the beauty of that, whether it's for a pocket flap or for a single welt, is you have 3 folds, which makes for a flatter finish. You don't have the additional bulk here or here. So this involves some pattern making. We're going to be making the pattern for the single welt. And as you guess, we have a lot of work to do. So let's get busy. This is the placement of the single welt pocket on this particular jacket. Now, something I'm going to point out here. Notice it is not perpendicular to the grain line. You can see I have a grain line marked here, so it has a slight angle. Now, the method that I'm going to be using to make this single welt pocket will work the same for the flaps. The flaps are just completely rectangular. So this is just something to be aware of. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a piece of paper. I'm going to fold, because this fold is going to represent that line on the top of the pocket. So then you just slide this underneath and zoom in a little bit so we can see what I'm up to. There we are. So what I will do here is line up the fold of the paper with the top fold of top line of the welt. So from here, I like to trace off these two, the ends of the welts, and also this line here where it joins the body. And again, also, it's good to have the grain line here, because especially if you're matching a stripe or a plaid, that's useful information. So now when I bring this out, this is what I have. So let me set this aside and we will continue. So here we have what we just traced. So what I will do here, just to eliminate confusion, flip it over, because this then will be face up on the left jacket front. So I'd like to just draw these lines here. So from here, we're going to cut this out on these lines. You'll see where this is going in just a moment. So we cut the lines out. And I like to write front on it, so we know that that is facing out. From here, we want some Scotch tape. We want to tape these ends closed, because as you saw in the introduction, the object here is to avoid a seam on each of these ends. We'll be pivoting these to the back. So the initial setup is that we need to pin. We need to tape these two ends closed. So it's going to create a little envelope. So I'm going to write back on this side. So I'm going to flip this way. We need to establish the two seam lines. And the easiest way to do it is we're going from the cut edges to the corner. So we fold the end with line, the end up with the fold here, fold the end here, line the end up with the fold here. So we have two creases. Now these two creases, this is where we draw the lines. I'm going to call these out A to A, and the corner is B. This is C to C, and the corner is D. Now A and C are on the cut edge. Now a common mistake is people will draw the lines from here to here. Don't do that. Okay, now that we have the lines, we want to open it up. We want to cut just through one layer. Cut from A to B through one layer. We're going to cut from C to D through one layer. And then this is our pattern. I will go back in, draw a line from B to D. And then I like to establish our grain line because we want that line on everything when we take it to the fabric. So this here, this is our paper pattern for this pocket. So to begin, what we're going to do is we're going to lay the piece of paper on the table. We're also going to lay silk organza out on top of it. Now the object here, you want the silk organza, of course, square of grain. You want the grain line of the silk organza parallel with the top fold line B to D. Then I'm going to pin this down a couple places. Because what we want to do here is we want to draw all of this information onto the organza. So what that looks like, we are going to take, and this is one of those times that you can use the permanent markers. No one's going to laugh at you. So I want to copy off all the information from the paper to the silk organza. Okay, so we have everything copied off. And just for clarity, I'm going to call out the letters here. And also, we want the grain line marked. So there we have it. This is now our piece. What I would tell you is do not cut this out. I'm going to repeat that. Do not cut this out. These are stitching lines. We will trim the seam allowances later. Now the next thing we need to do is to get the canvas. So here's a piece of canvas large enough for this welt. So now what you want to do is fold everything back together, and you want the straight of grain or the cross grain, either one, parallel to this fold here. So I'm just going to pin that like so. So cut this out to shape. And then, zoom in a little bit here. Then, to explain, before I do the next step, we will have a fold on this edge, a fold on this edge, and a fold on this edge. So to compensate for the turn of cloth, we need to remove an 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch. So what that looks like is eighth of an inch on this end, 1/8 of an inch on this end. If you go a little more than an 1/8 of an inch, that's not going to be fatal. You just want this smaller. And of course, we have police action going today because I live in New York City. Then we shave off the top. So what I did here, while the sirens were wailing, is I shaved off an 1/8 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch, and an 1/8 of an inch. So the next step is applying this to the organza. So now I'm going to bring the organza on top of the canvas. Now you notice I'm lining up this line here. The reason the organza is on over the canvas is that the face fabric will be on top, the organza will sandwich between, and the canvas will be on the inside, so that when we construct this particular pocket, it will face the direction we wish, so we can apply it to the left side of the garment. And so now what you can do here is just kind of shift everything around to make sure everything is centered. Now we go to the machine. So now we come to the machine. We're going to set the stitch to a serpentine or a zigzag stitch. The width of this stitch is 5.0. The length of this stitch is 1.25 to 1.5. So really, you can see now the advantage of having the organza over the canvas. The organza is going to hold everything in place. So we really just want to sew this canvas. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be sewn. So okay, so let me remove this from the machine, trim the threads, and give you a chance to look at the results. So there we are. That is what we've created so far. Now I will press this and meet you back at the work table. Here we have the face fabric, and you can see here I have marked out the grain line. This is very important. So now what we're going to do, this is the organza side. We're going to turn this way so the canvas is facing up, and then what we want to do is line up the grain line with the grain line on the fabric. This way you don't really have to worry about there being any kind of a mismatch. If you just made a rectangle and just put it on willy-nilly. Some fabrics would really show the grain lines mismatching. This is one of those fabrics. So now that everything is secure, there are two rows of stitching we need to sew. The first one is we want to sew on the outside, up this way, over and down. So what I will do is go get a marker, mark out that stitching, and show you how to sew it. You can see here that I have marked in pink. And notice the marks are outside this rectangle. You want these marks to be on what's going to end up being the back side of the welt so that you don't see any of this stitching when the welt is sewn into position. So the first pass around these three edges is just a tiny little running stitch. You're just barely picking up the back of the fabric, and if you do it right, you won't really see it. That's the object. See, what we're doing with this organza is we're hanging the canvas from the organza, and we're using the organza as our marking device. You could use this method with just some fusible canvas if you wanted to, but I just think this gives a better result. It gives it a little more heft. It's a little more reliable. So now let me just secure this thread. And I will bring it up to the camera. You can see the result. So you can see that stitching is outside these lines here. Now there's one more row of stitching. We want to machine stitch just outside the cut edge along here. So I will meet you over at the sewing machine to demonstrate that. So at the machine, we're really going to start the stitching just about there. And the stitching is going to be about 1/16 of an inch or so outside the marked line. This is going to serve as a guide for later. This is just a standard 2.5 stitch. Oh. There we go. Okay. Take this out of the machine, show you the results. And this is not fatal. I'm going to take it out anyway. It just goes to show sometimes you forget to turn the stitch back to the straight stitch. So let's look at this. So yes, you can see that stitch is just outside the cut edge of your canvas. So now, this is all secure. We're now ready to sew the ends. I will take you back to the work table. This is where the letters come in. See, what we want to do, these two here will form the miter. So what I'm going to do here is put a pin through at point C, and I'm going to fold these right sides together and find the other point C, which, there we go. So you pin both point C together, and then you pin baste, Make sure that the two stitching lines fall one on top of the other. You pin baste like so. Now the next step, which I will go over to the machine and do, is to sew from point C to point D and back tack. I will bring you back the results. So here, there we go. You can see that I have sewn from point C to point D. And if you get a teeny tiny bit of mismatch on the back, that's not going to kill you. So the next step is to trim off that to about 1/4 inch, clip a corner here, and clip 90 degrees right at the end of this stitching. So I finished one of the two miters. So when you lay this flat, you can see after we press that open, there's going to be a miter. So I will go off camera and sew and trim the other miter and meet you at the pressing table. Before we begin, it's good just to press as sewn. Then I'm going to bring in the point presser, because what you want to do now is to overlap these two seam allowances so they'll lay flat, and then press the seam open. The object here, we want everything as flat as we can possibly get it. So here's the other one. So again, overlap like so, overlap, and open up. So there we are. We can put this aside now, because then we want to turn this right side out. Turn it right side out and use the point turner so that's our first pass. So as you can see, oh, here we are. Zoom in here. Before I press, I like to have these seam allowances overlap. I don't want them bunching up. I want them to create as flat a surface as possible. So now, I'm going to get my clapper, because that's the next step. Steam and press. So there you have it. Now I'm going to show you a little trick for making these corners as crisp as you can get them. To get a corner to press as crisply as possible, you thread up a needle with some Mara 30 or other strong thread, and then you catch this corner like so. From here, put it onto the pressing table, and then as you're pressing, you pull the thread and then draw the thread out. And that will give you a nice crisp corner. Now there's one final row of stitching. You can see here, there is the row of stitching we used to sew the organza to the back of the wool. To close the welt, to prepare this to install into the body as a pocket, we're going to go over that row of stitching one last time. This is a standard straight stitch, and let's start there. Okay, so let me take this out of the machine, trim the threads, show you the results. So yeah, there it is. And you can see the slight diagonal. The grain is going to read correctly when it is installed on the front of the jacket. So let's go back to the work table to assess what we've accomplished. So here we have the single welt. You can see here the angle that is reflected from the pattern, so that when this is in place, there won't be any change of texture on the front of the jacket. Now what you see here is I have made pocket flaps for the lower pockets, which we will use later. The pattern for the lower flap measures 2 1/4 by 6 1/4, and as you can see, I did the entire process as I did on the single welt. The only difference in the construction is that the fold is facing down, whereas on the single welt, the fold is facing up. So now we have the welt and the pocket flaps. We can continue by installing the welt into the body.